World knew Ace Frehley as Kiss's Space Ace, but when the stage lights went dark, one man was left alone with demons that even the brightest pyrotechnics couldn't illuminate. Behind that silver makeup and those smoking guitar solos lived a secret that would eventually shake the entire rock world to its foundation. It was 1978, and if you were alive then, you remember it. The year when every member of Kiss released solo albums on the same day. 4 records, 4 visions, 4 egos. But Ace's album did something nobody expected, something that would change everything forever. It outsold the other 3 combined, and in that moment of triumph, the seeds of destruction were already taking root. Paul Daniel Frehley grew up in a working-class Bronx neighborhood where dreams were luxuries most families couldn't afford. His father worked construction. His mother held the family together through sheer force of will. The apartment was small, the money was tight, and the future looked like it would be more of the same. But in the corner of his parents' bedroom sat an old acoustic guitar that his father barely touched anymore. Ace was 13 when he first picked up that guitar. His hands were too small, his fingers too weak to properly press down the strings. The calluses hadn't formed yet, so every chord hurt. Every note required effort that left his fingertips raw and aching. But something about that pain felt right. Something about struggling to make those strings sing felt like the first honest thing he'd ever experienced. He practiced obsessively. While other kids played stickball in the streets, Ace sat on the fire escape with that guitar, teaching himself blues licks from records he'd bought at thrift stores. B.B. King, Albert King, Chuck Berry. He'd play the same passage over and over, hundreds of times, until his fingers bled. Then he'd tape them up and keep going. His parents didn't understand it. Music wasn't a career in their world. Music was something you did at weddings and church. Music was a hobby, not a future. They wanted Ace to learn a trade, get a union job, live a stable life. But Ace could feel something bigger calling to him, something that had nothing to do with stability or safety. By the time he was 18, Ace Frehley had developed a style that borrowed from blues, rock, and something entirely his own. His playing wasn't technically perfect. He never would be the fastest guitarist or the most precise. But there was something in his touch, in the way he bent those strings, that carried raw emotion. When Ace played, you didn't just hear notes, you felt something. He bounced around various New York bands through his early 20s, never quite finding the right fit. Groups would form, play a few gigs, then dissolve when rent came due and dreams gave way to reality. Ace took construction jobs to pay bills, showing up to work sites with hands still sore from the night before's rehearsal. His co-workers thought he was crazy, wasting his time chasing something that would never happen. Then came the audition that changed everything. October 1973, Ace showed up at a loft in Manhattan to try out for a band that didn't even have a name yet. 3 guys were there. A bass player who breathed fire and wanted to conquer the world. A rhythm guitarist with a star painted on his eye who moved like Mick Jagger, and a drummer who could swing like a jazz cat but hit like a freight train. They were putting together something different. Not just another rock band. A spectacle. A show. A phenomenon. They wanted makeup, costumes, explosions, and guitar solos that could melt faces at 50 yards. They needed a lead guitarist who could play like he was possessed and look like he'd arrived from another planet. Ace plugged his Gibson Les Paul into a Marshall amp, cranked the volume to levels that made the windows rattle, and proceeded to play the most blistering audition of his life. His fingers flew across the fretboard with practiced precision. The pentatonic scales he'd spent years mastering poured out in waves of distorted fury. Blues licks met hard rock aggression. Melodic phrases collided with raw power. When he finished, the room was silent. Then Gene Simmons, the bass player who would become known as the Demon, smiled. That was exactly what we needed. Welcome to the band. We're going to call ourselves Kiss. Creating the personas was where things got interesting. Gene would be the Demon, breathing fire and spitting blood. Paul Stanley became the Star Child, the pretty boy frontman. Peter Criss was the Catman, cool and dangerous. But what about Ace? The makeup design came from Ace's own hand. He drew it himself, those silver lines and stars that would become iconic. The character was Space Ace, an alien visitor who communicated through guitar solos instead of words. Cold, distant, mysterious. Everything that Paul Daniel Frehley from the Bronx wasn't. But here's what nobody talks about. That makeup became a mask that Ace could hide behind. On stage, he wasn't an anxious kid from a rough neighborhood who worried about money and wondered if he was good enough. He was Space Ace, untouchable and cool, firing smoking guitar solos into crowds of screaming fans. The character gave him permission to be someone he couldn't be in real life. The early Kiss years were a grind that would have broken most bands. They played anywhere that would have them. Dive bars, high school gymnasiums, shopping mall openings. Sometimes 20 people showed up. Sometimes it was 5. They loaded their own equipment, drove through the night to the next gig, slept in the van when they couldn't afford hotel rooms. But something was building. The show was so over the top, so theatrical, so absolutely insane that people who saw it couldn't stop talking about it. Word spread. Crowds grew. The makeup and costumes made them memorable in ways that regular rock bands couldn't match. Kiss wasn't just a band. They were an experience. Then came 1975 and the release of Alive, the live double album that captured Kiss at their most explosive. The record company had been ready to drop them. 4 studio albums had sold respectably, but not spectacularly. Alive was supposed to be the final attempt, the last chance to prove they could sell records. Instead, it went multi-platinum. Songs like Rock and Roll All Night and Detroit Rock City became anthems. Suddenly, Kiss wasn't just another struggling rock band. They were legitimate rock stars. The concerts got bigger. The production got more elaborate. The money started rolling in, and with the money came everything that money could buy, including all the things that would eventually tear them apart. Ace's guitar work on Alive showcased his talent in ways the studio albums never quite captured. His solos on She and Deuce had that perfect balance of technical skill and raw emotion. He wasn't trying to show off or play faster than humanly possible. He was serving the song, creating moments that made crowds lose their minds. The tours that followed were legendary. Kiss became known for their stage show. Explosions, fire-breathing, blood-spitting, and Ace's smoking guitar that seemed to catch fire during his solos. They filled arenas. Madison Square Garden, the Forum in Los Angeles, massive stadiums across America and then around the world. Everywhere they went, pandemonium followed, but success brought pressure that none of them had anticipated. The record company wanted more albums, faster, more tours, longer, more merchandise, everything. Kiss wasn't just a band anymore. They were a corporation, a business, a machine that required constant feeding. And Ace Frehley was struggling to keep up with the demands while maintaining the Space Ace persona that was becoming more exhausting with each passing day. By 1977, something was wrong. The other band members could see it even if they didn't want to acknowledge it. Ace was showing up late to rehearsals. Sometimes he wouldn't show up at all. When he did arrive, his hands shook. His playing, usually so precise and powerful, became sloppy. He'd forget parts of songs he'd played 1,000 times. His eyes behind that silver makeup looked hollow. The truth was simple and devastating. Ace had discovered that alcohol and pills could make the pressure disappear. Not permanently, of course. Nothing could do that. But for a few hours, he could forget about the weight of being Space Ace. He could forget about the demanding tour schedule. He could forget about the tension building between band members as egos inflated and money created distance. He could just float for a while. Problem was, floating became the only way Ace knew how to cope. Before concerts, he'd drink to calm his nerves. After concerts, he'd drink to come down from the adrenaline. On days off, he'd drink because there was nothing else to do. The pattern was so gradual that he didn't even notice how completely it had consumed him until it was too late to stop. Without help he wasn't ready to ask for, the rest of Kiss tried to ignore it at first. They were all partying. That was just what rock stars did in the 70s. Everyone had their vices. Everyone pushed limits. As long as Ace could still play, as long as he could still be Space Ace on stage, they could look the other way. But the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Ace wasn't just partying. He was disappearing into something dark and dangerous. The decision to have each Kiss member record solo albums came from their manager, Bill Aucoin. The band had conquered the world together. Now it was time to show what each member could do individually. 4 albums. Same release date. September 18, 1978. It would be unprecedented. A massive statement. Kiss wasn't just one entity. It was 4 powerful creative forces. Gene Simmons approached his album with typical ambition. He recruited famous guest stars, wrote songs that showcased his range, and created something that felt like a major statement. Paul Stanley crafted a record that highlighted his songwriting and vocal abilities, positioning himself as the true heart of Kiss. Peter Criss made an album that leaned into his jazz and R&B influences, and Ace Frehley went into the studio essentially alone. No famous guests, no elaborate production tricks, just Ace, his guitar, and his vision. He played most of the instruments himself. He sang lead vocals in that distinctive voice that was more personality than technique. He chose songs that felt authentic to who he was, not who Space Ace was supposed to be. One song in particular stood out, New York Groove. A cover of the obscure 1975 song by Hello, it was pure Ace. Catchy, melodic, and soaked in the kind of New York attitude that Ace had grown up with. The guitar work was tasty without being showy. The production was clean and direct. Everything about it felt right. When the 4 solo albums were released simultaneously, the music industry watched with fascination. This was the biggest experiment in rock history. 4 members of the same band competing directly against each other and themselves. Critics wondered if it would expose weaknesses. Fans wondered if it would destroy the band. Everyone wondered what would happen next. Ace Frehley's album didn't just sell well, it crushed the others. New York Groove became a legitimate hit single, reaching the top 15 on the Billboard charts. His album went platinum while the others struggled to reach gold. The quietest member of Kiss, the one who rarely spoke in interviews, the guitar player who hid behind silver makeup and let his instrument do the talking, had proven he could succeed as a solo artist. The victory should have felt sweet. Instead, it created a tension within Kiss that would never fully heal. Gene Simmons, who saw himself as the brains and business force behind the band, had been outsold by Ace. Paul Stanley, who considered himself the creative heart, watched Ace's album outperform his own. The hierarchy everyone had assumed was permanent suddenly looked unstable. But here's the tragedy. Ace's success didn't make him happy. It didn't solve his problems or quiet his demons. If anything, it made everything worse. Now he knew he didn't need Kiss to be successful. Now he understood that the thing he'd been hiding behind, the Space Ace character, might actually be holding him back. But he also knew that walking away from Kiss meant walking away from everything he'd built his entire adult life around. The drinking got worse. The pills increased. Ace started missing more rehearsals, more sound checks, more obligations. During the 1979 Dynasty Tour, there were nights when he could barely stand up straight on stage. His guitar solos, once so precise and powerful, became meandering and sloppy. Fans noticed. The other band members could no longer pretend everything was fine. The confrontation came backstage at Madison Square Garden in 1980. Kiss was playing their hometown, the place where they'd become legends. But Ace was in no condition to perform. He'd been drinking since early afternoon, mixing alcohol with prescription medications in combinations that should have killed him. When Paul Stanley found him in his dressing room 2 hours before showtime, Ace could barely focus his eyes. What followed was an argument that crew members still talk about decades later. Paul screaming that Ace was destroying everything they'd built. Ace shouting back that Paul didn't understand what it was like to live behind that makeup, to be Space Ace instead of being himself. Gene trying to mediate, but ultimately siding with Paul. Peter Criss caught in the middle, battling his own demons and unable to help anyone. The show went on because the show always went on. Ace stumbled through his parts, missing cues, forgetting solos, barely maintaining consciousness. 50,000 fans who'd paid to see Kiss at their best watched Space Ace crumble in real time. After the concert, everyone knew something had to change. They just didn't know what that change would look like yet. For the next 2 years, Kiss tried to hold things together. They recorded albums with Ace present in body but absent in spirit. Session musicians secretly played his parts when he couldn't. His photo appeared on album covers for records where he barely participated. The lie was elaborate and painful, but the business demanded it. Kiss was too valuable to admit publicly that one of its founding members was falling apart. Ace knew what was happening. He watched himself become a ghost in his own band. He saw the pity in people's eyes when he showed up late or not at all. He heard the whispers about replacement guitarists. He felt the distance growing between himself and the guys he'd started this journey with years earlier in that Manhattan loft. And he hated himself for it. Hated his weakness. Hated his addiction. Hated that he couldn't be the person everyone needed him to be. December 1982. Ace Frehley sat in his Connecticut home, guitar in lap, staring at platinum records on his wall. Space Ace stared back at him from album covers and posters. That silver makeup, those stars, that character who'd given him permission to be extraordinary. All of it felt like a prison now. The phone call from management came on a Tuesday afternoon. They wanted to discuss the next album, the next tour, the next phase of Kiss. But Ace already knew he couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't put on that makeup one more time. Couldn't pretend to be Space Ace when Paul Daniel Frehley was dying inside. Couldn't watch session musicians play his parts while he collected a paycheck for doing nothing. He made the decision right there, before the meeting even happened. He was done. After 9 years of being Space Ace, after helping build Kiss into one of the biggest bands in the world, After platinum albums and sold-out arenas and millions of fans, Ace Frehley was walking away. Not because he wanted to, but because staying meant destroying himself completely. The official announcement came in January 1983. Ace Frehley was leaving Kiss. The press release was diplomatic and vague, talking about creative differences and desire to pursue solo projects. The truth was messier and more painful. Ace was leaving because he had to save his own life, and he couldn't do that while being someone else every night on stage. What followed were the darkest years of Ace's life. Without Kiss, without the structure and purpose that being in the band provided, he spiraled even further. The drinking intensified. The drug use escalated. Days blurred into weeks. Weeks disappeared into months. Ace lost track of time, lost track of himself, lost track of everything except the next drink and the next high. His wife Jeanette tried to help, but addiction doesn't listen to love. Friends reached out, but Ace pushed them away. Former bandmates called occasionally, awkward conversations filled with things nobody wanted to say. The music industry moved on without him. New bands rose up. Kiss continued with a replacement guitarist. The world kept spinning while Ace Frehley tried to figure out how to be a person instead of a character. The lowest point came in late 1984. Ace woke up in a hotel room with no memory of how he'd gotten there. His hands were cut and bleeding. His guitar was smashed in the corner. And he had absolutely no idea what had happened or what he'd done. For the first time, real fear cut through the haze of addiction. This wasn't fun anymore. This wasn't rebellion or rock and roll lifestyle. This was death approaching, slow and inevitable. Something shifted after that hotel room. Not immediately, not dramatically. But slowly, painfully, Ace began the work of putting himself back together. He checked into rehab. He failed. He tried again. He relapsed. He tried again. Recovery isn't a straight line. It's a messy, ugly, ongoing battle that requires showing up every single day and choosing life over escape. In 1987, Ace formed Frehley's Comet, a new band, a fresh start, a chance to be a musician on his own terms without the weight of Space Ace and Kiss expectations. The music was harder, heavier, more aggressive than anything Kiss had done. It was Ace unleashed, playing exactly what he wanted to play without compromise. The album sold respectably, but not spectacularly. Frehley's Comet never reached Kiss heights, and Ace had to make peace with that. He wasn't 19 anymore, wasn't the hot new thing, wasn't going to set the world on fire again. But he was playing music on his own terms. He was sober more days than not. He was Paul Daniel Frehley instead of Space Ace. And slowly, painfully, that started to feel like enough. When Kiss announced a reunion tour in 1996 complete with original makeup and costumes, Ace faced a choice. Return to the character that had nearly destroyed him, or stay away and protect his hard-won sobriety. The money was astronomical. The nostalgia was overwhelming. The chance to prove he could do it right this time was tempting beyond measure. Ace rejoined Kiss for the reunion tours, and for a while it worked. He was older, more experienced, more aware of his triggers and limitations. He could put on the Space Ace makeup without losing himself completely. He could play the hits without drowning in nostalgia. He could be part of Kiss without being consumed by it. But the dynamic had changed. Gene and Paul ran the business now. Ace and Peter were employees, highly paid but ultimately disposable. The magic they'd all created together in the 70s couldn't be recaptured. They were going through the motions, performing nostalgia for audiences who wanted to remember when rock and roll felt dangerous and new. By 2002, Ace was done again. This time it was different. He wasn't running away. He wasn't escaping. He was simply finished with being Space Ace. He'd proven he could return. He'd shown he could perform at the highest level. But he didn't need Kiss anymore. Not financially. Not emotionally. Not spiritually. He'd become his own person, finally, after all these years. The solo albums Ace released in the 2000s and 2010s were revelations. Anomaly in 2009. Space Invader in 2014. Spaceman in 2018. These weren't comeback attempts or desperate grabs at former glory. These were confident, mature works from a guitarist who'd finally figured out who he was and what he wanted to say. The playing was still there, that distinctive Ace Frehley style that blended blues feeling with hard rock power. But there was something else now too. Wisdom, experience, perspective. These albums weren't made by a young man trying to prove something. They were made by someone who'd survived hell and come out the other side with stories to tell. Critics praised the work. Younger musicians cited Ace as an influence. Guitar magazines wrote retrospectives about his contribution to rock. Slowly, the narrative around Ace Frehley shifted. He wasn't just the troubled member of Kiss who'd struggled with addiction. He was a guitar hero who'd helped define an era, survived his demons, and continued creating vital music decades after most of his peers had retired or died. Looking back now, from the distance of years and perspective, Ace Frehley understands something about Space Ace that he couldn't see during those wild years in the 70s. The character wasn't a prison. It was a gift. Space Ace gave a shy kid from the Bronx permission to be extraordinary. The makeup allowed someone who struggled with confidence to command stages and captivate audiences. The persona created space for Paul Daniel Frehley to become the guitarist he was always meant to be. The tragedy wasn't Space Ace. The tragedy was losing himself so completely in the character that he forgot where the persona ended and the person began. The addiction, the drinking, the pills. Those weren't caused by being in Kiss or wearing makeup. Those came from running away from himself, from trying to be someone he wasn't, from never feeling like he was enough. In interviews now, Ace talks about those years with a mix of pride and regret. Pride for what they accomplished. Kiss changed rock and roll. They created something unprecedented. 4 guys from nowhere became legends. But regret for the cost. The relationships damaged, the years lost, the pain inflicted on people who loved him and wanted to help. When fans ask about reunion possibilities or future Kiss collaborations, Ace is diplomatic but firm. That chapter is closed. He's grateful for everything Kiss gave him, genuinely grateful. But he's done being Space Ace. Done wearing the makeup. Done playing the character. Paul Daniel Frehley has finally emerged from behind that silver face paint, and he's not going back. Today, in his 70s, Ace Frehley still plays guitar. Still records albums. Still tours when his health permits. The hands that once shook so badly he could barely hold his Les Paul are steady now. The eyes that once looked hollow behind silver makeup are clear. The person who nearly died chasing an image has finally found peace being himself. The platinum records still hang on his wall. The photos of Space Ace still exist. The legacy of Kiss endures. But when Ace picks up his guitar now, he's not trying to be anyone except who he is. A guitarist from the Bronx who helped change rock and roll. A man who struggled with addiction and survived. Someone who spent years hiding behind a character before learning the most important lesson. Being yourself is harder than being anyone else, but it's the only way to truly live. Space Ace was a gift, but Paul Daniel Frehley is the achievement. The character created the opportunity. The man seized it, lost it, fought for it, and finally claimed it as his own. That's the real story. Not the makeup, not the stage shows, not the platinum albums. The story is about a human being learning, painfully and slowly, that the mask you wear eventually becomes a mirror. And when you finally take it off, you have to face whoever's been hiding underneath all along. Ace Frehley faced that person, fought with that person, and ultimately made peace with that person. That's worth more than all the gold records and arena shows combined. That's the legacy that matters. Not Space Ace the character, but Paul Daniel Frehley the survivor. The man behind the silver makeup turned out to be more interesting than the character ever was, and that might be the most rock and roll thing of all.